Hello, my name is Jessica Turner and I work for the Northumberland Coast Outstanding Natural Beauty Partnership, and I work as the Historic and Built Environment Officer for the designated landscape. I'm delighted that Nick has invited me along today to talk about the life and times of St Cuthbert and the sort of Anglo Saxon Northumbria that he was living in. Obviously, I'm sure we're all aware before I start that the reason why we're putting a little bit of heritage into this talk today is obviously St Cuthbert's close association with the Eider Duck, commonly known, locally known as the Cuddy Duck after St Cuthbert. We'll touch a bit about on that further on into the talk, but it's nice to have an opportunity to talk about our remarkable northern heritage, our early Christian saints, and an absolutely fascinating period in the area's history. Before I start on St Cuthbert proper, I just thought I would touch upon what the Northumberland Coast Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty is, in fact. As I'm sure most of this audience are aware, designated landscapes, that's national parks and AONBs, came out of sort of a post-war ambition to safeguard the very thing that we were fighting World War II for, ugly, green and pleasant land. And it was a remarkable undertaking around about the same time that we created the National Health Service. So it's absolutely fascinating period and a remarkable undertaking, as I said. So an AONB is a precious landscape that distinctive character and natural beauty has to be safeguarded for the nation. That's the main purpose of the designation. And within that, we conserve and enhance. There are a total of 46 areas of outstanding natural beauty in the UK, and obviously the Northumberland coast is the most northerly in England. It's very, very slim. It's only 2.4 kilometres wide at its widest point, and it stretches basically from Spittal just to the north of Amble. And as you all know, it's beautiful, beautiful coastline full of sand dunes, rolling sand dunes, and tranquil coastline with some rocky outcrops and some amazing heritage. I think that's the most remarkable thing personally about our coastline here. And that's one of the interesting things also about this AONB. We are the only AONB in the country to have a full-time permanent historic environment post. So good for me, but also I think testimony to the landscape. As you walk along, you'll have all seen castles and the remarkable heritage that's out there. So that's what I do. I currently am also working on another project, which is called Accessing Aiden, which is a National Lottery Heritage funded project for 3 years, interpreting the Bole Hole burials from Bamborough and focused on this Anglo-Saxon heritage. So that's why I'm in quite a good position to do this talk today, though actually, admittedly, I have never done a talk on St Cuthbert, so I had to do a little bit of research, and I imagine there's people in this audience today probably know more about St Cuthbert than I do. But this is a starter for 10, let's put it that way. But I know a lot about Aiden, so they link very closely, as I will touch upon as we go on. So to emphasise my point, in fact, I've put this stained glass window, which is from Pickering, of the 3 sort of great northern saints. There are many more than these 3, but these are the sort of 3 main players in terms of the early Christian heritage of Northumberland and the north of England. So St Cuthbert, St Oswald and St Aidan. In terms of chronology, just so that we're all aware of why I'm talking about this and how long ago all of this happened, basically, St Cuthbert was born 1,376 years ago. That is quite a way, in a period that we call the Anglo-Saxon, or some people call the Dark Ages. It's sort of post-Roman, Romans leave in 410, and Britain didn't have the same borders that we have now. It was basically broken up into a series of sort of principalities and fiefdoms and chiefdoms, and tribes sort of loosely working in sort of regional areas. So I've included St Oswald and St Aidan in this because they are intrinsic to the story of St Cuthbert, because it was with St Aidan returning to Northumbria in 634 and realising he was ruling pagans, called back to Iona from where he'd been in exile, for Aidan to come and help him convert the Northumbrians to Christianity. And they started the Christian mission that St Cuthbert carried on in his ministry. So that's why it's very important to show these 2. I also included this picture because St Cuthbert is often shown holding a head, and the canny-eyed amongst you will realise that the head he is holding is the head of the man next to him, St Oswald. He is often shown holding Oswald's head. Though these two will never have met during their lifetime, post life, in death, they were united, and Oswald's head was put into the grave with into the coffin with Cuthbert, and that's why they're shown together quite often. So everything I'm about to tell you is remarkable, given, as I said, this all happened 1,300 years ago plus. But for a very far off historical figure, we actually know a remarkable lot about St Cuthbert, in part due to an anonymous life of St Cuthbert that was written by a monk on Lindisfarne shortly after his death, and then by this man, Bede, the Venerable Bede, who also wrote a life of St Cuthbert. We actually wrote two versions of the life of St Cuthbert, one in prose and one in verse. So we know an awful lot about Cuthbert, but you have to take everything that Bede says with a pinch of salt, because he really is a propagandist for the Roman Christian Church. So this is one of the reasons for Cuthbert's elevation above that of Aidan and Oswald, who are the founders of Christianity in Northumberland, and sort of Cuthbert overtakes them, basically because during Cuthbert's reign in 664, the Synod of Whitby decreed that the two competing Christian ideologies that were meeting in Northumberland at that time, which was the Celtic Christianity that came from the monastery of St Columba on Iona, where Oswald had been exiled, and where Aidan grew up in his Christian practice. They had founded the monastery on Lindisfarne and were teaching a Celtic Christianity. At the same time, or slightly before, obviously, St Augustine came into Kent, and so was pushing a Roman Christian story up through the country. And the two met when King Oswu's wife, who was a Roman Christian and he was a Celtic Christian, and they ended up celebrating Easter at different times. So one half of the couple was still fasting for Lent, while the other half of the couple were celebrating and feasting Easter. So it really brought things to a head, which resulted in the Synod of Whitby, which the two sides argued with the king about the best way to proceed. And the king eventually came down in favour of the Roman Christian Church, and the monks of Lindisfarne, very disgruntled, went back to Iona to remove themselves from the new Roman ways. But Cuthbert, who was ministry, brought up as a child and in early adulthood in that Celtic tradition, was one of those missionaries that was able to accept the Roman rule. So from a propaganda point of view, he was ideal. So he was a native, but he was able to accept this new Roman rule. So from writing about the Christian story, Cuthbert is an ideal candidate. So that's why perhaps he eclipses Aidan, though Aidan probably founded this Christian mission in the first place. So this story will take us from the hills of Melrose all the way to the founding of a fabulous cathedral of Durham. So it's a little bit of a whirlwind around the north of Britain. This is a quick chronology, basically to show his life. Cuthbert's life was adventurous enough, but in death, it was even more adventurous. So the left hand of the screen shows Cuthbert in life, and the right hand of the screen is Cuthbert's body and his travels in death. It's quite remarkable. As I said, we know he was born in 634. This was the same time that Oswald came back to Bamborough to found the Northumbrian kingdom. So it gives you an idea of why they would never have met. We know quite a lot of detail even about his early childhood, and we know he was fostered by a widow called Kenswith. We know this because through the writings of Bede, it talks about miracles, and there's several miracles associated with Cuthbert's childhood. I'll point out that this illustration is of Cuthbert prior to joining the monastery, because as you can see, he's in his home clothes effectively. This illustration comes from one of the copies of the Life of St Cuthbert in the British Library. This dates to about the 12th century, but it's got fantastic illustrations, which I've included throughout this talk. In 651, Cuthbert was sitting on a hillside outside Melrose, tending sheep, when he saw a vision of a light coming down from heaven, and then the light descending, going back with a choir of angels, and found out the next day that St Aidan had died at Bamborough that night, and that was a vision of St Aidan's soul ascending to heaven. And this spurred Cuthbert onto joining the monastery and joined as a novice. We think he was probably quite high birth, actually, because again, in the life of St Cuthbert, they talk about him riding a horse. And obviously only noble birth would really be able to afford to have a horse. So we think he's actually high birth, and fostering, I should say, was very commonplace to sort of high birth children, because that's commonplace for them to learn and grow in the care of another family, usually. So he joined the monastery at Melrose, and his rise, in terms of ecclesiastical rise, was quite rapid. By the age of 21, he was the guest master at the newly formed monastery in Ripon. They returned to Melrose in 662, due in part to a little bit of a falling out with St Wilfrid, who is the famous St Wilfrid of Hexham. So there's already quite a lot of political intrigue going on at this stage, but he returns, but becomes the prior of Melrose. 662, there's a plague hits Britain, and the prior of Melrose dies, and that's how Cuthbert inherits the post. 664, as I've touched upon, Synod of Whitby, massive change in terms of the Christian tradition. So removal of the Celtic tradition. The Celtic monks were sort of had a missionary zeal, very much about going out and preaching and teaching people the ways of God. Whereas the Roman was slightly more disciplined, and obviously and the hierarchy of the Pope, etc., is very important. And also the other thing that's probably worth pointing out about the Celtic Christian church is women had a much higher place in the hierarchy. And obviously we've all heard of St Hilda, and she was the abbess of Whitby at the time that they did the Synod of Whitby. But at that stage, women could hold as really powerful positions in the church, in the Celtic church, as men could. So the Synod of Whitby not only gets rid of the Celtic tradition, it also changes the role of women within the church as well, which, depending on your gender, you might find interesting. Anyway, by 664, the Synod of Whitby, but as I've said, Cuthbert embraces the change. He's one of those native Celtic Christians that is able to embrace the change and carry on teaching, but equally with the adherence to Rome. As a result of that, he is made the prior of Lindisfarne, because as I also said, the majority of monks on Lindisfarne went back to Iona at that stage after the Synod of Whitby. So Cuthbert, as a native, was able to take over as a prior. And that's really where sort of his reputation flourished. He still practiced the Irish way and was out travelling amongst the brethren, preaching love and tolerance and peace and living at one with nature. And a very humble life, but absolutely missionary in his zeal at that stage. But 10 years later, by the age of 41, he has a change of sort of religious leaning or need, and actually decides that he'd be best served if he could worship as a hermit, commune with God alone, more or less. So what he does is, first of all, goes off to the small island off Holy Island, which is called St Cuthbert's Island, and builds himself a little cell there and lives there for a while, but found that people could still get to him quite easily, because as we all know, you can walk across from Holy Island to St Cuthbert's Island at low tide very easily. So that really wasn't peaceful enough for him. So then he went off in 675 to Innerfarn to get as far away from everybody as possible. And again, built himself a cell on Innerfarn. We know roughly where that cell was. He also had a well, and there was a small church, and there was a guest house for people. He also had 2 monks with him on Innerfarn. But he again built himself a cell, but built with no windows in, so that all he could see was the sky, so that he could commune directly with God. But people still came to visit him, and actually he became quite exasperated. And so when those storm events happened, people couldn't get across to him. He was at peace and probably at his happiest. So he continues like that for another 9 years or so, until 684. There's the Synod of Twyford, which is possibly happened in Almouth on Chapel Hill. There was formerly a large monastery site there, and we think that Synod of Twyford, a very important synod that actually made Cuthbert the Bishop of Lindisfarne, happened on that site. He had to be persuaded out of his retirement, his hermitage, to take up the post. He was originally elected as the Bishop of Hexham, but that was far too urban for him, I suspect, and so did a swap so that he became the Bishop of Lindisfarne. And he did start to travel again at that stage amongst his people. We know, again, from the life of St Cuthbert, he was far across as Carlisle, and he was on Coquet at this stage. But again, after 2 years, it was all a bit too much. Resigned again from the bishopric. Must have known he was close to death and ill, because in 686 he returned to Innerfarne and spent just about a year there until he died on the 20th of March, hence why we have an Eider Duck Day today, on the 20th of March, in 687, aged about 52, 53. Now, against his wishes, more or less, he wanted to be buried on Innerfarne and left alone. The monks took his body back to Lindisfarne. There's a great bit of detail in the life of St Cuthbert about how they'd had a pre-arranged sign that when Cuthbert died, the monks on Lindisfarne with him would light a beacon, and the monks on Holy Island would know it happened. They were watching from the watchtower. We have archaeological evidence for that watchtower now on the Hjuff and 2 really early Anglo Saxon churches. So if anybody's up on Holy Island, please go and have a look, because both of those, the 2 churches are on display. The foundations are visible for people to see. So he was taken back to Lindisfarne, as I say, against his probably desire, and was buried by the altar in the church. 11 years later, this is when it all this really cements Cuthbert's fame. They decide to translate his body. So they were going to move it from the burial place next to the altar to a stone sarcophagus in front of the altar. Now, on that translation, the opening of the coffin, they've discovered that Cuthbert was incorrupt. Now, that means he hadn't decayed, his body hadn't decayed. So this was taken as miraculous. From an archaeological point of view, it's not impossible for a body to not decay. Given the climate on Holy Island, it's quite windy and dry, but with moistness in the air, it's probably perfect situation for actually preservation of flesh or soft tissue. I was going to show you a picture of St Bees Man, but I decided it was a little bit too horrific for us on a Saturday to be looking at St Bees Man. But basically, this is a body of a crusader from, I think, the 12th century that was excavated from St Bees in Cumbria. And he was excavated in 1981 and was basically, as the monks of Lindisfarne would have said, incorrupt, and that he was still flesh. You could still see his beard. You could even see the irises in his eyes. So it's not impossible, but I'm not saying it's not a miracle, but it was certainly taken that St Cuthbert being incorrupt was absolutely evidence of God's divine wish and how holy Cuthbert was. It was around this same time that the Lindisfarne Gospels were produced, either in response to finding the incorrupt body or maybe in advance of the translation, which was planned. And from this point, the veneration of Cuthbert is huge. And it really takes off. Again, it's slightly political, again, given that he was this Celtic Christian that was able to embrace the Roman tradition. But also there's a change of sort of ethos. The Celtic Christians would frown upon sort of veneration of relics, whereas it was very much a European thing, Merovingian, in fact, to the sort of the veneration of a relic. So it was sort of the new European trend that was also taking hold as well. So that's another reason for the political and sort of chronological advantages of Cuthbert. So the monastery on Holy Island flourished with lots of dedication and offerings were given, and the monastery grew very rich and affluent. There's a poem from around this time that's sort of suggesting everything was getting a little bit too comfortable, perhaps, on Holy Island. It's sort of talking about the fine cloth and feasting, and in fact, one of the monks had a wife. So it was all getting a little bit relaxed about 100 years or so later. And then we have the first recorded Viking raid in 793. This was an interesting wake-up call, or certainly that's how the church portrayed it, because as we know, the Vikings weren't recording their raids, but so again, it's a little bit more propaganda going on here. The church saw this as a reason to tell the monks off and say, hey, perhaps you've been a little bit too lax. Go back to the teachings of Cuthbert and Aidan, back to a bit of austerity and really commune with God, sort of back to your first purpose. So again, it took another 100 years or so, but the Viking incursions on Northumberland weren't as strong as, say, they were in Ireland at that time. But the Vikings start sort of making a reappearance in the late 800s, which eventually leads to the folk of St Cuthbert moving the coffin off the island and basically travelling around the region for 7 years. We know they went to Norham, possibly Melrose, all the way across to Whitehaven. Apparently the intention was they were going to take St Cuthbert's coffin over to Ireland, but as they approached the sea turned red. So they took that as an omen and decided, actually, no, that's not what Cuthbert wanted. So they returned sort of back the way they came, and eventually getting to Chester Street in 883. And they built a church there and stayed there for about 100 years. But again, another Viking incursion in 995 meant they were unhappy again. So they decided to move from Chester Street, move south, interesting, to Ripon, but only stayed there for a couple of months. And the body of Cuthbert intimated it was time to go back to Chester Street. So they put it back on a cart and started pulling it back to Chester Street. It got to a bend in the river, a muddy field, and the cart stopped dead, and they couldn't push it or pull it. And then the abbot, who was in charge of this group of monks that were pulling this cart across the country, had a vision from Cuthbert saying he wanted to be buried in Denholm. Now, they weren't local, obviously, having travelled around the region and been at Chester Street for 100 years and then Ripon for a couple of months. They weren't au fait with the topography. And it's at that moment they encountered a cowgirl looking for her brown cow, a dun. And another cowgirl saying, oh, I'd seen a brown cow down at Dunholm, which was a bit further down and basically a field. So the monks followed her to Dunholm, and that became Durham. And on their site, they then built the first church, which eventually became the cathedral. And in 1104, they translated Cuthbert's body once again into the shrine of St Cuthbert, which is at the back of the altar. And then, interestingly enough, Cuthbert survives the dissolution of the monasteries intact as a body, which is quite remarkable given the destruction that occurred at that time. And this is one of the reasons why the Lindisfarne Gospels survives, because that was in with the coffin as well. And then the coffin was finally opened again in 1827 by antiquarians quite interested in looking at Cuthbert. It's worth noting, as I sort of said earlier, the head of St Oswald is in with Cuthbert, so has accompanied him on his travels. The head of St Oswald has multiplied, and there are several claims to having the heads in continental Europe. He's a particularly popular saint in Germany and Austria and northern Italy. So his head is in with St Cuthbert, and when they opened the coffin in 1827, there is a head in there, and it does have a weapon injury in the skull, which is consistent with how Oswald died. There are also some of the bones of St Aidan in with Cuthbert. So the three of them are united in this remarkable journey across northern England. So that's a quick chronology of Cuthbert. So I just thought I'd touch on nature and Cuthbert, because as I said earlier, obviously we know that the cuddy duck is known as the Eider duck is known as a cuddy duck, but Cuthbert has quite a few links with nature, and they occur in his miracles. So I've used the Life of St Cuthbert illustrations to put a few of them up here. Now, obviously, the first illustration, you can see Cuthbert is in his home clothes. So this is prior to joining the monastery. But this is on his way to the monastery with his lovely horse, which shows he's of noble birth. But on their way, they were very, very hungry and couldn't find any food. But the horse managed to find cheese and bread in some hay. So this was seen as one of the first miracles of St Cuthbert. So that's links to a horse. And obviously he was very kind and shared his fare with the horse. Another miracle is early in his ministry, and it's when he's at Coldingham. He goes to visit the monastery at Coldingham. Incidentally, it's founded by St Abbs or St Ebba, who was the sister of King Oswald, St Oswald. So the Christian tradition and the royalty were very closely linked at this stage, and you quite often get very high birth, particularly the women joining the church. it's politically astute thing to do. And this is actually a real change in terms of religion and marrying the church and state together. It all stems from King Oswald's time. So he visits Coldingham, which is actually a joint monastery of men and women together. And the story is that Cuthbert needed to get away from the people, so went down to the sea. And in this image, the middle image, you can see a rather large monk is spying on Cuthbert, who is shown twice in this image. Once in the sea, he stayed in the sea all night, praying with his arms to God throughout the night. And then when he came out of the sea, which is the second picture of St Cuthbert seated, some sea otters came out of the sea and dried his feet with their fur, and he blessed them, and the otters were very happy and they went away. Now, this monk obviously very surprised to see this happen, but Cuthbert had noticed him, so he sidled up to him early on in that day and said, "Don't tell anybody until I'm dead." And then that was seen as another miracle of Cuthbert, but again linked to nature, and it links to his preaching about being kind and gentle and living at one with nature. Another miracle, which is, again, actually quite a lot of his miracles are related to food. So this one is, again, he is traveling with two novices, and again, they hadn't really worked out their provisions clearly. And again, by praying to God, this is apparently a dolphin. That a dolphin appeared broken into three and ready cooked for them to eat straight away. There's more miracles. This one, again, with an eagle. Again, they were traveling and hungry, and an eagle appeared and dropped a fish ready for them, which they split into two and gave half to the eagle, and then Cuthbert and his companion had the other half. The middle image, I think this is when we sort of really get to Inner Farn, is his cell in Inner Farn. And obviously the birds were pecking at the seeds that they were sowing. So he's responsible also for agriculture. So he's able to sow barley on Inner Farn, but came out and talked to the birds and told them not to take his seeds, and the birds duly obliged. Now, the third picture is those same sowed birds coming back, being very sorry for having taken his seeds. They're penitent. You can see that the heads are bowed and the wings are low. And as a way of recompense, they brought Cuthbert some pig lard, which is what you can see the bird at the bottom. And again, this one isn't related to food. He used the pig lard to waterproof his shoes. So these are all the miracles of Cuthbert. But what it does show, whilst they're quite amusing and these images are lovely, it does show that he did live humbly and meekly, loved everybody and everything equally, including nature, and lived very much in harmony. And that's why he's regarded as sort of the first sort of patron saint of conservation, in fact. And the cuddy duck was especially dear to him on Inner Farn in particular. And that's why they're called cuddy ducks now. He made sure that the other monks didn't touch the ducks, and actually the ducks were allowed to wander anywhere, even some of them nesting by the altar inside his church. So you do see quite a close association between Cuthbert and the duck, and quite often he's portrayed with the cuddy duck or the eider duck close to him. So I've just put up two quick ones of stained glass windows. The full image here is from Amble, and you can see three cuddy ducks, three eider ducks by his feet. And then the other larger one where you can just see those lovely pig-larded boots of his, or shoes, and an otter, obviously, which relates to the sea otters coming and drying his feet, and then an eider duck by his leg. I mean, from a nature conservation point of view, I'm not sure how well a cuddy duck and a otter would get together in normality, but maybe the lard on the shoes is distracting the otter from the duck at that stage. But also the other thing, that another tradition that comes about, again related to nature, is a thing called St Cuthbert's beads, which you find on Holy Island. It's a fossil, it's a crinoid actually, but they're plentiful on Holy Island. And from that, because this fossil occurs regularly on Holy Island, so this myth legend has sort of built up about, actually it was St Cuthbert on Holy Island praying for help to convert or to maintain Christianity in Northumberland, and all these beads fell onto the beach for Cuthbert to make rosaries out of, and people still do sometimes use these crinoid fossils to make rosaries, so it's quite nice. In fact, fossils have quite an association with saints generally. If we think of St Hilda, you'll see St Hilda is often shown standing on snakes. Now this relates to the geology and the fossils of Whitby, where she was abbess, because there are an awful lot of Ammonites there. So the legend became actually that Whitby was inflicted with a plague of snakes. And actually what Hilda did was she prayed and turned them all to stone. And that's what the Ammonites are stone snakes. So it's quite interesting, I think, with Christianity and nature and how these two things can merge. One, to explain the unexplainable sometimes, things like fossils, which, until relatively recently would be very strange occurrences. But obviously these fossils relate to when this part of the world, this tectonic plate, was under the water and somewhere near the equator. But, to an early medieval mind, it's very difficult to explain why you would have a stone plant growing in a rock. So you get quite a lot of association like that. And you also get association with animals. St Aidan is often shown with a stag, and Oswald is often shown with a raven. Again, this sort of harks back probably to pagan religious beliefs, because Woden, who they believe that Oswald was ascended from, was shown as a raven as well. So it's making links to a pagan belief, and also bringing that up to date and bringing into the Christian tradition as well. So it's a really fascinating way of iconography and symbolism within the church. So as I said, the big thing for Cuthbert was the incorrupt body. Again, that's not unusual in terms of our northern saints, because Oswald's arm was incorrupt due to being blessed by St Aidan. So we again got this tradition of incorruptness, but absolutely seen as very holy. And this is what took Cuthbert on his travels across the north of Britain. But it also resulted in some remarkable Anglo Saxon treasures, which are astounding from an archaeological point of view, the sort of preservation of these amazing artifacts. One is St Cuthbert's cross, which is probably not from when Cuthbert was buried originally, but probably pilgrimage and offering later on, but it's still very much in that Anglo-Saxon tradition of garnets and gold. The survival of the coffin is astounding from an archaeological point of view, but again, showing some interesting climatic conditions that meant that preservation is feasible, but it shows early Anglo-Saxon wood carving, which is astounding for an archaeologist. And then St Cuthbert's Gospel, which was tucked in the robes of St Cuthbert in his coffin. And again, probably dates to the translation of the body. But this is an original bound copy of, I think it's St John's Gospel. These are absolute treasures of the British Library, and the coffin and the cross of Durham Cathedral Library, and well worth going to see if you get the opportunity. I'll just mention just one quick picture of the shrine. So from quite humble beginnings of Melrose to a remarkable shrine at the back of the altar in Durham. Again, if you're in Durham, go and see it. It's absolutely wonderful space. It's beautiful, worth seeing. So just thought very quickly I would talk about the sort of what was happening in Northumberland around this time. So post-Roman Northumberland, as I say, they went and it sort of the country broke down into various kingdoms. And we up here well, I'm in Alnwick, I don't know where everybody else is listening to this, but up here in the north of Northumberland, we're in Bernicia, and Doria is to the south of us, sort of York area. Those two kingdoms were temporarily sort of united by a king called Ethelthryth in the late 500s. He was a pagan king, so he gets a very bad press, obviously, from Bede, but he is the father of Oswald. So what he did is he went down into Doria, killed Alla the king, exiled Alla's son, which is Edwin, later known as St Edwin, and married Alla's daughter, Acca, brought her back up to Bamborough. It's reputed that Bamborough is called Babenberg, which is actually Ethelthryth's first wife. So Acca is the second wife. Whether Babam was still in residence in Bamborough when she came back, I'm not entirely sure. But Acca proceeded to have 5 children with Ethelthryth, including Oswald and Ab, who I mentioned earlier. In 613, Edwin revenged the death of his father, and along with the Mercians, killed Ethelthryth the great pagan overlord in battle. And so Edwin had the rightful sort of claim to both thrones of Bernicia and Deria. So Acca, instead of welcoming her brother back and saying, lovely to see you, decided actually, no, the safest thing for her children, because they are direct rivals to Edwin, was to flee. And she fled across Britain up into the Strathclyde area to the Dalrita and asked for refuge there. And her sons were all put on to the monastery of St Columba on Iona. And she and her daughter Ab went to a female monastery close by, but that is lost in the mists of time, partly due to Bede not really writing very much about women, I suspect. So in 634, Oswald comes back after the death of his uncle to reunite the kingdom, but also to save Northumbria from the ravaging of Cadwallader, who was the pagan overlord from the Welsh side that was coming and sort of giving the Northumbrians a very, very hard time. So he met them at Heavenfield, which was a battle site just outside of Hexham, and it was actually very outnumbered in this battle. Raised across to God the night before the battle, and the success of his small number of soldiers is seen as direct evidence of God's affirmation that Oswald was the rightful king, and for him to bring Christianity to Northumbria. And because he was a direct descendant of both Alla and Ethelthryth, he had complete claim on both kingdoms, and so united the kingdoms, and that became Northumbria, north of the Humber, all the way to Edinburgh, more or less. He encountered, despite Edwin and St Paulinus's efforts, he encountered a Northumbria full of heathens and pagans, so called back to Iona for help to convert them, to convert his kingdom, and eventually in 635 Aidan arrived, founded his first church in Bamborough on the site of St Aidan's Church now, and then eventually set the monastery on Iona, on Lindisfarne, given the similarities to Iona, a tidal island with the rocky outcrops. So he set about ministry. Now he only spoke Irish, so Aidan would go around preaching across the province, across the territory, and Oswald would go with him and translate. So together they established the foundations of this Christian tradition. That later, that vision of Aidan's soul going to heaven inspired Cuthbert to join the church, and that's why we have this remarkable history, and it sort of starts here with these two really interesting characters, Oswald and Aidan. So just to the reason we know this, so we know so much about Cuthbert because the life of Cuthbert, we also know an awful lot about the people that were living here at the time, thanks to a research project by Bamborough Research, in fact that's what's called Bamborough Research Project, who have been centering their studies and research around Bamborough Castle, in particular, picking up Brian Hope Taylor's excavations that he did in the 70s. Now, there's a long-held rumour in Bamborough that there was a Viking burial ground somewhere in the sand dunes. I think this rumour was in part helped by the fact on the first edition OS map, it says Old Danish Burying Ground. So various storms had dislodged some bones from the sand dunes in this area. Brian Hope Taylor tried to find the cemetery site, but Bamborough Research Project came along in 1999 and decided, like all good archaeologists, to rely on their map data and put a trench more or less through the D of the Danish burying ground here. And what they discovered is this coincided with an area called the Bowl Hole, which from an archaeological point of view is very strategically good because it meant it wasn't covered in meters and meters of sand dune. It was this sort of hollowed out area with no sand dune. So removal of about a meter of sand brought them down to a soil surface, which was historically significant. But instead of, Viking longships, like Sutton Hoo, there's no garnets, helmets and shields or anything like that. Actually, what they discovered was straight burials. Now, I've put skeleton up here to warn you that I'm now going to show some pictures of skeletons. There'll be about 10 or so there's more squeamish of you might want to look away, but this is your warning that now follow pictures of skeletons. So, as I said, instead of Viking longships and garnets, they found inhumations. single inhumations with no grave goods or very few grave goods. The picture on the right hand side is of a bone comb, and that's the sort of extent of the things they were finding. So this immediately suggests you're looking at a Christian burial ground, because the skeletons are east-west with the heads to the west, because we all know that's the Christian tradition, because the second coming of our Lord will be in the east. So Christians are buried east-west with the heads to the west, so that when our Lord comes, we are all able to sit up and face our judgment. That's why we have that tradition. So all the skeletons in the burial site were single inhumations, more or less, and east-west, though some varying with crouch burials, as you can see the picture in the middle, or straight inhumation, supine or prone. Supine, when they're prone, it means they're face down. That's got another Christian tradition. Perhaps they hadn't confessed close enough to death, so they're not actually worthy of facing our Lord when the judgment comes, etc. So just to give you an idea of this population, I'm going to talk about 7 skeletons very quickly, and in particular, just because it just gives you an idea of the population. It gives you an idea of Aiden's and Cuthbert's congregation, and it sort of gives you some insight into what was happening in Northumberland at that time. So around the same time that they started this excavation, which actually was a research dig, which carried on until 2007, they were also able to get funding to do isotope analysis. Now, isotopes are held in the enamel of your teeth, and they are the mineral trace of the environment in which you were brought up. So the DNA gives you, a root of where you may have evolved from. Isotopes in the teeth tell you exactly where that person was living. So we've got a really interesting group of people, men, women, and children. So it's a mixed population. It isn't a burial site of the elite of warriors who have fought in battle or anything like this. It's very much a population. The radiocarbon dates put this cemetery to around 650 to 700. So absolutely and utterly the time of Aidan and Oswald and Cuthbert. So, and if we take that, extrapolate from that, this is a Christian burial ground, this is their congregation. These are the people that Cuthbert was preaching to. And that's a really remarkable thing to be able to say about a cemetery site. So anyway, so this skeleton is of a woman, probably 60 plus when she died. And her isotopes suggest that she came from Bamborough. Bamborough pure, absolutely within a couple of miles of Bamborough. So what's interesting also about the population as a whole is that less than 10% come from Bamborough. And actually we're looking at a very cosmopolitan population. So this skeleton is a male. You can tell it's very much more robust skeleton. Probably died in his mid to late 20s. But his isotopes suggest he came from somewhere much warmer than Northumberland, and probably somewhere on continental Europe, somewhere like Italy, perhaps. The other interesting thing that his skeleton tells us is he had terrible gout. So by 28, to have gout is suggesting a very, very rich diet. And we can all extrapolate from that because this is so close to the castle, the Bolehole Cemetery is just to the south of the castle, that perhaps we're looking at the artisans and courtesans of the court here, because it's a very rich and varied diet. They're very robust, their teeth are dreadful, again, probably because of a rich diet. This skeleton, you again immediately see this is a much slighter build. This is a skeleton of a female. Her isotopes suggest she came from Southern Ireland, and she has some really interesting sort of evidence of her living on her skeleton. She has a condition that we colloquially call a weaver's bottom, which is where the muscles on the thighs sit against the bone, and it becomes very exaggerated in pattern. So you can see that that's probably from large muscles in the thighs, which is maybe from continually crouching. And then she also had a small nick in a front tooth, which might be from holding a needle or a thread. So again, that backs up this. Perhaps we're looking at the courtesans and artisans of Oswald's court here. This skeleton, slightly different. This is called a crouch burial. This is a male skeleton, and his isotopes suggest he comes from Scandinavia. So the big Viking raid in 793, if this dates from 650, we had, there was quite a lot of tradition going backwards and forwards from Scandinavia prior to the Viking raid, again, sort of reiterating that actually a lot of it's propaganda from the church at that time. So the Scandinavians would have been well aware of the monastery on Lindisfarne and how rich it was prior to the eventual invasion. And I should say, he was probably about 60 plus when he died as well. So this skeleton is a child's skeleton. This is a really fascinating skeleton. It's because as anybody that has a 10-year-old child at home will know, the mandible is full of teeth and has both the milk teeth, the baby teeth, and the adult teeth present. So there's 2 hits of isotopes on this skeleton. She or he, can't sex a child's skeleton, was probably 8 or 9 years of age, 10 years of age. And the isotopes suggest that her baby teeth, which form in the mother's uterus as a fetus, suggest that the mother was somewhere incredibly hot, somewhere like southern Spain or possibly North Africa. And then that she spent her childhood somewhere warmer again than Northumberland, somewhere like the south of France. So in the space of 10 years, this child has crossed possibly, been through 2 continents to get to Northumbria. That's fascinating itself. So, what is the reason for that migration? And that's, a pretty remarkable undertaking. Is it possibly this new religion? Because let's face it, Christianity was a new religion at that stage. And it was preaching something that was radically different from the pagan religions that went before, which was all about rewarding bravery and warriors. Actually, what they were preaching was that we were all equal in the face of God. And as long as you're good to each other, you will be rewarded in heaven. That's a remarkable change in ideology, which must have been very appealing for a lot of people. So maybe they were religious migrants, maybe it was socio-economic, who knows? But what's interesting is 1,400 years ago, people were still traveling, people were still migrating and moving to countries, and creating this cosmopolitan population that we have now and we had then. And this skeleton, the canny-eyed amongst you will notice it's missing a head and its lower legs. It's difficult to say why the head is missing. There's no evidence of weapon trauma on the actual vertebra that's remaining, but the head is not there. But as you can see, the head would have been quite high. So even in death, skeletons can move around a bit. So we're not sure why that head's not there. But this is one of the few skeletons that does show weapon trauma, which is quite interesting. And also you'll see the skeleton next to it is face down. So that's an interesting couple of skeletons here. But the weapon trauma on this individual is basically a single sword blow through the ball of the shoulder all the way down and taking off part of the hip. You'll see normally the pelvis has an extra bit of bone there, and that's a sharp cut through that. So sharp was that sword blow, it even took a nick out of the patella, the kneecap. So it's a single sword blow, needless to say, fatal. But because we don't have his teeth, we're unable to say where this individual came from because we don't have the head. But we can say that he was probably about 19 years of age when he died because of the fusing of the distal end of his collarbone. It's a really useful aging technique on skeletons. So we know he was a young man, but is the only evidence of weapon trauma. Typically, battles in Anglo Saxon Britain didn't happen at settlements, they happened at territory edges. So that's why we wouldn't expect to see a huge battle-worn population here, but it's interesting nevertheless. And finally, this last skeleton is probably the least photogenic, but probably one of the most interesting in that this skeleton dates to 650. Its radiocarbon dates to 650. This man was 50 years of age when he died, and his isotope suggests he came from somewhere like Iona. So it's fair to say, given his age, he is a direct contemporary of Oswald and Aidan. So this man is most likely to have travelled from Iona back to Bamborough with Oswald when Oswald came to reclaim the throne in 634. So he would have been their friend, basically. And that's just a remarkable thing from an archaeological point of view, to take a northern saint and actually bring it down to a really sort of tangible level of these are people that he spoke to and talked to and knew. And that's just brilliant from an archaeological point of view, but from a theological, it's amazing too. So I'll conclude now that it's this amazing sort of cosmopolitan population that resulted in remarkable things such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, which are rightly treasured as one of the most remarkable and beautiful pieces of early medieval literature and art. But this carpet page, I think, sums the whole thing up, because it sort of mirrors and this sort of reflects that cosmopolitan population, because there's tones of the Germanic zoomorphic patterns with the animals and birds. There's lots of birds in this picture, but also it sort of chimes of sort of more Islamic patterns and things, as well as there's more Celtic knotwork in this. So it's taking all these cultural influences and merging them into one remarkable British treasure. And I also like to think that this sort of reflects the sort of teachings of Aidan and Cuthbert, in that, you know, everybody was equal and everybody's artistic endeavour was valid and worthy of celebration. And it's only with this melting pot of all these cultures that we get this remarkable golden age of Northumbria. And finally, there are animals on the corner of this, and those heads look a little bit like ducks or animals. It's difficult to say. But again, even in celebration, in art, sort of that link with nature is really apparent and worth celebrating. So thank you very much.